Hi, everyone. This is Lourdes Turrecha, founder of the Rise of Privacy Tech, and you're tuning into the Rise of Privacy Tech webcast. We are doing a series on defining the privacy tech landscape, and today I'm really excited to have Nishant Bhajaria as one of our guests for this series. He is one of the leading privacy engineers in the industry, with current stint at Uber and previous stints at Nike, um, Netflix, and Google. So Nishant, thank you so much for your time and welcome to the Rise of Privacy Tech's webcast series.
Thank you.
So I'm going to jump right into the question and answer portion of this, like we discussed earlier. I'm curious, what interested you in the emerging privacy tech landscape, and why do you're super busy as a privacy engineer working in tech. Why do you spend time advising and engaging with the emerging privacy tech startup ecosystem?
Thank you, Lord. So basically, I was in this field for a while before the space really picked up. So I was in the identity space at a company called WebMD. And then I worked for a startup in downtown Portland, and we built the first OpenID platform. Privacy was not the core product, but the idea of engagement, accessibility, data collection was key to those industries even back then. This was more than a decade ago. And then what has happened since 2016 is the field has picked up the GDPR, the Privacy Shield, CCPA. And then, of course, there's been all these tools that have come up in the last couple of years. I remember when I was at Nike, we onboarded Big ID for the first time, and that felt like a pretty big deal. We were moving our data to the cloud, building engagement models, things like that. So I have been in this field for a long time. So I want to create a new generation of privacy engineers so it becomes easier to build these tools that are privacy sensitive. So you find that right balance between compliance and trust. Trust is important because that builds a relationship directly with the customer. Compliance is important because it's nice to not get in trouble with the law, right? So I've been in this field for a long time. What I've also noticed is that this field moves in ebbs and flows. Basically, then there's a lot of activity, there's laws being passed, there's fines, and then sometimes people forget the lessons and things go back to normal. So I try to balance my job where I lead global privacy engineering at Uber. I try to balance that with doing enough for the community so that the next generation that comes out actually has better answers. I remember back in 2014 and 15, when I was looking for information about, am I doing the right thing? Am I building the right team? There was nothing available. IAPP was just starting out in DC hosting their conferences. So I'm pretty sure somewhere right now there is an engineer looking for the right answers. And my hope is with my courses, my book, my public statements, they get some support and context to start with.
Do you find that the emerging privacy tech startups have the training that you wish they had when it comes to their engineers or privacy engineers in general? Do you see them working with privacy engineers, the bulk of them?
Well, yes and no. Yes, in the sense that there are a lot of tools coming up. Like there's a lot of startups. I remember back in 14, 15, it was Big ID and OneTrust. If OneTrust may or may not be the case. But now there's a lot more tools, right? There's a lot of companies, there's a lot of money flowing in this direction. So awareness is pretty high. But awareness and knowledge are not the same thing, right? Even within companies, you see privacy engineers being disconnected from other engineers. You see privacy legal and privacy engineering being disconnected. And then public policy is further separate. And the comms team is sitting again further out, right? So you have all of these different folks trying to do the same thing, the right thing, which is find that balance between customers, between trust and compliance, but they don't talk to each other. So sometimes when it comes time to make the decision, do I or do I not onboard this tool? Do I or do I not collect this data? Sometimes those decisions are left to an engineer who may not have the right context, right? So yes, support exists. It's better than it used to be 5 years ago, but we're also moving faster. We're building more tools. We're collecting more data. There's a lot more bad actors out there. So the reward is higher, but the risk is even higher, right? So it's a yes and no answer to your question.
Yeah, absolutely. Just for benchmarking purposes, I ask this question with all the other privacy leaders that we interview. How many privacy tech startups would you say you're working with, either as an advisor, and you can delineate between the buckets as an advisor, and then second as a customer, and then as a follow-up to that, I have a couple of follow-ups as to what you're looking for when you're working with them.
Yeah, so I know my team is looking at a vendor called Data Grail. I'm talking to Wirewheel. They recently hosted me for a podcast with Alex Gibbons from Center for Democracy and Technology. So there are a few engagements on the customer side, but I also have worked for companies like Netflix and Uber where we tend to build a lot of our stuff in-house. So that build we
Yeah.
buy argument is something that never ends, even if you happen to be me.
Right.
My engineers would know a lot more about the details because they report to me. And when it gets to a point where a decision has to be made, that's when I get pulled in. So I'm not quite sure how far those conversations are right now. When it comes to advisory, I'm working with a company called informally with a company called Laminar. I'm working with
Mhm.
a company called Usercentrics. They're based out of Germany. And I'm working with a company called Layer 9. They're based out of Silicon
Yep.
Valley here. The goal is pretty simple. I'm trying to achieve two fundamental wins here. The first is make sure that I can have a platform that can meet multiple goals, which is catalog data, help with privacy reviews, help onboard customers more easily, essentially fix multiple problems at once. If you make a pure privacy argument, it takes a lot more effort to onboard somebody. But if
Right.
you make the argument that you're going to minimize data collection, if you're going to help onboard categorization of data so you can do policy enforcement in a more automated fashion, that helps you achieve security goals, that helps delete data so you end up spending less in terms of storage costs, that improves data quality. So that's my first goal, which is how do I make sure that any tool that I'm advising meets multiple goals for customers, because budgets tend to be tight. So you
Yep.
have to make an argument to enable the business and meet privacy goals at once. So that's the first goal. The second goal I'm trying to make sure is achieved is that the decision to acquire tools is made from a place of knowledge. Typically, companies onboard privacy and security tools when something bad has happened. Either there's a fine or a breach or a consent decree. And when you are panicked, you don't always make the best decisions. So how do you make sure that the engineers, the attorneys, the policy specialists, the compliance specialists have the right information before that crisis hits, so you don't end up buying the wrong tool? For example, if you're buying big ID, you have specific needs, that is data discovery, categorization, reviews. But if you are panicked, you might end up buying one trust instead and then complain that the tool doesn't work, when in fact you bought the wrong tool for the wrong reason. So the one is
Right.
to make the platform successful, and the second is to make informed purchasing decisions.
Those are really, and I think you answered my next question, but let me just make sure I understood correctly. Your goals are also what you use to determine whether you build or buy. So I
Exactly.
heard you say, you want to make decisions from a place of knowledge. You want to make sure that a tool that you're bringing on solves multiple problems, not just privacy ones, because it's easier to make that case to buy such a tool. Are there other factors that you consider when you're making the decision to either onboard an external tool, a vendor, versus asking for the internal resources to build the tools that you need? And what are other things that would come to mind other than the two goals that you mentioned?
Yeah, I think the other key goal is to evaluate what onboarding this tool is going to look like. Because what happens when
Mhm.
it comes to privacy and security tools is that there's a very federated, decentralized model where typically the Netflix microservices and infrastructure is pretty famous, right? You basically have a sea of microservices where there's a full separation of concerns. So if you buy a tool, who's going to wield the political clout within the company to make sure that there is onboarding? So as an
Right.
example, let's say you buy this third-party tool that deletes data by either by obfuscating it or by erasing it, by resetting your clusters, what have you. There's multiple ways to do deletion. But there is always going to have to be a handshake where your central deletion tool sends a signal saying this data ought to be deleted. That signal gets sent to a bunch of services. Those services then have to send a signal to their storage houses, right? So there's a sequential aspect to it. How do you make sure that all this onboarding happens correctly? Because if you buy this tool, but the services don't onboard it, your deletion infrastructure will still remain pretty puny. And then you end up having to disclose this data in a DSAR, a subject access request, when you get a lot of bad publicity because now you have told people this data was deleted, but in fact it
And it
wasn't.
wasn't.
And then you gave people this proof upfront, right? So it makes you look bad and ineffective. It makes the tool look bad. So it's very critical before you onboard a third-party tool that you have a clear understanding of how onboarding is going to work. What is the tech stack looking like? Is there any platform incompatibility? So it's important to make sure that the engineers are in the room when the decision is being made. Typically, these purchasing decisions are made by the CPO's office, that is the Chief Privacy Officer, or by the CISO's office.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Right.
And then what happens is the engineers then have to do a proof of concept. And after sinking 6 months in, then they decide this tool works or it doesn't. So my recommendation would be bring the engineers to the discussion sooner, because at
Early
the end of
on.
the day, if you don't, the engineers will leave or they'll do a bad job of onboarding it, which neither of which are helpful.
I couldn't agree, more with you when it comes to the onboarding comment that you made. I don't, and it's not just who onboards it and who owns it, but also the ease of onboarding. Right? I've seen companies that bought privacy tech tools, and then it takes them 6 months to onboard a tool, and that's just a non-starter. And some of these early privacy tech startups have failed and shut down because of the difficulty in which it took to onboard their tool, especially we're talking with enterprise companies that have complex systems in place. So thank you for sharing that. You mentioned CISOs and CPOs as having the budget. I also see them as customer profiles, but I'm increasingly hearing that CIOs and maybe even product teams could be potential buyers in this case. Are you seeing that trend as well? And if so, what are the use cases for when a startup would want to go to CIOs and product teams for their privacy tech tools?
I'm so glad you asked the question, because this is going to be one of those untold secrets where we're going to wonder 6 months from now, why didn't we see this coming, when in fact it's staring us right in the face. In fact, I would say the next big story is going to be the CIOs and the chief product officers driving acquisition of privacy tech, right? Let me give you a couple of concrete examples. When data enters the company, it goes through the Edge API, it comes to the load balancer, then it goes to all your microservices, right? And then from there, it goes to emails, Jira tickets, Slack channels.
Right.
You call customer support because your UI isn't working correctly. You give them a ton of information. Some poor customer service agent is going to put that in Slack, contact an engineer. And now that data is flowing all over your company. The proliferation of private data or sensitive data all across your ecosystem in enterprise apps is the next risk vector. Because I bet you don't go back to Slack and delete that chat you had 4 days ago unless somebody actively tells you. So there's PII, for example, IP address, even SSNs, email addresses sitting in enterprise applications, which only the CIOs have appreciation for, right? And historically, engineers are not trained to diminish that data unless something goes wrong. So the CIO factor is pretty strong. In fact, if I were marketing privacy tech right now, I would approach the CIO first and then go from there to the CISO and the chief product officer, because the CIO has a bigger risk vector. In fact, the CISO might make the argument that I got all these smart engineers that can build a tool in-house. The CPO might make the argument that I'm going to give it to the CTO of the company. But the CIO has engineers and the risk at the same time within their domain. So I think that use case is pretty common. On the product side is, I think, even more promising, because a lot of chief product officers are finding out that they can't roll out products in time because at the last minute they find out that something related to privacy was missing, right? Additionally, the chief product officers routinely complain, not publicly, but privately, they complain that they cannot roll out cool products and features because all their work is going on the compliance side. Now, compliance is critical. You have to do compliance, but at some point you improve your privacy security reputation, not based on compliance, but based on user
going beyond.
Correct. So if you remember the testimony that Sundar Pichai gave before Congress at Google in 2018, I was at Google at the time. A bunch of questions he got was around dashboards, privacy centers, the ability for users to change what gets collected, what doesn't get collected. Remember that exchange with the member of Congress where they asked Sundar, if I go from here to there, can Google track my information? And Sundar responded by saying it depends upon your app, your privacy settings, your location settings, things like that. So chief product officers need privacy tools to make sure that they can optimize not just for compliance, but for trust as well. So I would say if you work in privacy tech, make the case to the chief product officer and the CIO quickly. Don't wait for the CISO's calendar to open up.
Oh, such a great insight. And thank you for sharing those use cases with the community. I'm curious, and I kind of have an idea, but I don't want to steal your answer. I'm curious which types of privacy tech startups you're most excited to work with. You could think of it in terms of categories. You could think about it in terms of the team or whatnot, or just whatever comes to mind. And then what are the factors that you use to rephrase that question? What are the factors that you use to decide whether or not you want to work with them, either as an advisor or as a customer?
So it's critical to solve a problem that exists, but people don't fully appreciate. One of the hallmarks of leadership is to invest yourself in an idea whose benefits are not visible today, but will be obvious tomorrow. So you need that level of patience and zest and perspective to take a bit of a risk here. So there are two key areas I'll give you examples of. The first is, are you measuring the risk and minimizing it early in the process? So a lot of existing tech startups tend to optimize for privacy when it comes to data at rest. So they will look at the warehouse and they'll say, we'll do deletion, we'll do categorization, inventory discovery. The problem is, at that point, think of a horizontal funnel going from left to right, the narrow end on the left-hand side. If you approach it on the right hand side, the size of data has grown significantly. So you cannot possibly scale your tool. At that point, you end up having to do sampling or optimizations with some level of scale, if you will, right? So the problem there is you are missing out on some key insights because sampling is by its inherent nature imprecise. So I'm asking startups, can you intercept data at the point of ingest before
Mhm.
any engineer gets their hands on it? So you can tag the data early on. You can delete some data before it gets used or made copies of, or before, heaven forbid, gets shared to a third party, right? So I'm looking at startups that are trying to catch data right at the point of ingest, at the
Earlier.
incoming point of the funnel, shift left, as often people say. And if you do that, you are optimizing to make sure that you don't slow down the flow of data, but make sure that the only data that flows downstream is data that you legitimately know you need, and the risk is obvious, right? So that's something I optimize for. The second thing I also optimize for is the UI. Too many privacy tech startups are focusing only on the back end because they are learning the lessons of
Mhm.
GDPR and CPA, which, and they are great, legitimate lessons to learn. But privacy is also about user facing features, right? So if
Yep.
you look at what Apple is doing with the IDFA, Google with the third party cookies, if you look at all the privacy settings that are pretty obvious, so you show users, here's all the data we collect, here's what we do with it, and the users can make a more informed decision in terms of, do I want this? Do I not want this? Now, initially, when you do that, you will see a drop in terms of the engagement rate because people are like, I had no idea you were collecting this data, but I'm not going to let you do it. And then they see that the UI is not that great because personalization takes a hit, right? Then the user comes back and gives you consent. But in this case, it's much more informed consent. So I'm looking for startups that will give you, for example, a very detailed but clean consent management screen,
Mhm.
a very good UI that will let you toggle your privacy selections. If you have those tools, you are taking away the pressure from companies to have to build their own UI. And also, because that UI is more industry tried and tested, the user is not going to be as confused, right? So I'm looking for tools that shift left when it comes to back-end compliance, but are also building UI that is more customer friendly.
Oh, to such great points about shifting left. We're seeing that, we saw that in security. I'm excited that there is that trend in privacy, and the importance of UI, not just backend, is something that we can't highlight enough. It helps us with building trust, right? Like especially when you're trying to sell in the B2B space to privacy conscious professionals or buyers. You really need, these startups need to be able to walk their talk and show that it's not just their backend tool that they've thought about, but also their UI when it comes to the tools that they're
And can
selling.
can I say one more thing, Lords, about that?
Sure.
Yeah, one of the key things people often underestimate is it's very hard to hire good privacy and security engineers. So if you
Yeah.
have a more diversified footprint of your platform, it becomes easier to keep the engineers happy and engaged because they feel there is customer impact, right? If you
Mhm.
work in privacy and security, generally the engineers, the PMs, the PGMs tend to have a strong sense of social justice, right? So if you're building a tool that provides visible direct benefit to the customers, the engineers will feel engaged and they won't quit after 18 months.
Right. I'm curious, what are some of the challenges outside of their UI and their ability to catch data at the ingress point of ingress? What are some of the bigger challenges that you're seeing these privacy tech startups struggle with, either as in your work as an advisor or in your role as a buyer? What are some of the basic things that you would have thought? You guys should have caught that.
Yeah, I think the real thing that is missing here is the fact that privacy engineers and privacy product managers and privacy legal, for that matter, don't have access to data. And I'm not talking about data that we collect about customers. I'm talking about data in terms of how are our products being used? How many queries are you seeing every single day? How many customers are clicking on this, right? If you had that kind of information, you could make better decisions in terms of how to implement privacy. So what I've done when I built my organization at Uber is I have not just engineers and scientists and people on the program side reporting to me, but I also have data analysts. These people tell me,
Mhm.
you built this tool, you put it up in the UI, here's how many people clicked on it, or here's how many people clicked on it from a certain geography. It enables you to understand the market a lot more. There's so much noise, Lords, in this space. There's so much commentary. There's so much high level first principles type talk. But when you have to make decisions, you have to make prioritization calls. You have to make decisions about what you're going to fund, what you're not going to fund, what is above the cut line, what's below the cut line. So you want to
And you
have a
need data for that.
you need data for that, absolutely. And impersonal black and white data. You need data that helps you make a definitive level of calls.
Mhm.
Because again, I go
So
back to the
are you saying that some of these startups don't have good analytics when it comes to that? Some of the when they're trying to sell?
some of them may not have good analytics, but they don't tell the story very well. Like oftentimes I have these
Mm.
folks pitch the story to me, and I feel like reaching out to the other side of the table saying, no, this is how you pitched me because this is exactly what I need. And I can't do that as a customer because there's obviously conflicts of interest here. But
Right.
making an argument based on here's how you improve. So if you collect less data, you will have to delete less. You will spend less in terms of incident response and data leaks and data breaches. You will have to spend less in terms of data quality issues, right? Nobody makes that end-to-end argument. I would love to see a startup that says good privacy is good business. They always make the argument for the most part
Yep.
based on risk, based on the fear factor. And
Based in compliance. And it's just such an
Exactly.
old story, right?
Exactly.
That doesn't resonate with the CIOs or other business leaders. It's a story they tell CPOs sitting in legal, basically.
Right. And the problem there is the staying power is a lot less, right? You want to create more champions within the company so that come renewal time, you end up making deeper inroads and you actually make a difference to people's lives, right?
Yeah, and you're preaching to the choir, and I love that. I love this whole privacy as a business value conversation, and it's exciting that more and more privacy pros are starting to do that. Not enough, however. I feel like we need to get to 100, but I'm I'm hopeful that more of us will be mindful of it's really about knowing who your audience is and what will resonate with them. So you're not always going to be pitching someone
Exactly.
in legal. Beyond compliance, so just jumping off of that, beyond compliance, what other types of privacy problems are you looking for a solution for, or a privacy tech tool for?
Yeah. So let me give you another example use case to answer your question. So how do you find the balance between enabling the business and doing it in a way that doesn't hurt privacy? So let's assume you launch an app on the user's device, right? In order to get the user the best experience, you want to collect some data before the user signs in so you can optimize for internet speed, device type, connectivity, things like that, right? But you are now collecting their data pre-consent because the user won't be giving you consent unless and until they sign in, right? So how do you
Right.
optimize for tooling that allows you to collect some data without consent, but sequesters that data someplace else, so you don't end up mixing that data with data that is collected post-consent that can be used for personalization? So how do you end up with this? It's like when you enter the US, you are in this immigration line where you aren't really in the country, but you are in the country. How do you create that line for data where you end up using that data only if the user consents, but you also respect their privacy and also enable their productivity? So I'm looking for tools that allow you to do that, because
Yeah.
some of this data is unstructured data that comes in via JSON blobs, which you can't really identify. So you could have an IP address, you could have somebody's personal data, device data, things like that, right? So I'm looking for use cases that will allow, and again, shift left on that front, which will let you collect that data without hurting privacy and getting in trouble from a consent perspective. So that's one use case.
That's such an important use case too, because we see that all the time. Every enterprise goes through that or has that use case that they're trying to solve. I feel like every single one of my previous clients have had to deal with that problem. As someone, so my last question, as someone who, unless there's a follow-up that comes up, obviously, as someone who has had the opportunity to onboard some of these privacy tech startups, what were some of the challenges that you faced in trying to get buy-in or the resources or the budget for these tools that you've vetted that met the factors that you're looking for, that meet the goals that you mentioned earlier? What are some of the challenges that you faced in getting a budget, and how did you solve them? Basically, how did you make the case to leadership?
Yeah. So it's gotten easier for me to surmount that obstacle because I've been in the field for a while and I have a profile of the companies I work for. But in general, the resistance you face is, but other people made this mistake and they didn't seem to pay a price for it. So it's easy to point at a company and look at their stock price 3 years ago when GDPR became law and today. And my rebuttal to that is, yes, a lot of these companies made a bulk of their mistakes before the scrutiny was high. So they have good legal departments. They can afford to hire strong privacy engineers. Do you want to be a company that didn't have those resources and faces that scrutiny? Because I can point to several more companies that ended up being scrutinized to death and they never recovered reputationally, and they were never able to pay down the tech debt as well, right? Because they kept fixing old privacy bugs to the point where people who should have been building features ended up fixing privacy bugs. So it's always easy to point out the counterfactual and demonstrate and quantify the risk, right? So you really want to be able to provide the data-driven argument, but you also want to point out to the fact that companies that end up getting into this deep, dark spot never fully come back. Your brand is forever tarnished, and that hurts your ability to get into new markets, raise money, things like that. So I would make the argument based on the aspirational future and how it gets inhibited because privacy becomes a bad story for you.
Thank you for that. And I do have a follow-up. You mentioned our privacy technical debt. How, given and we're still in our infancy or our nascency when it comes to the privacy tech landscape, especially compared to the more mature cybersecurity tech space, how would you describe your how hopeful are you that the current solutions out there, the ones that we have that are being built based on what you've seen, are actually making a ding to solve and pay back the privacy technical debt that we've incurred for decades?
I think there's a two-part answer to this. I think the tools are doing a great job. There's a lot of smart people. I mean, I work with a lot of these folks. I talk to them often. I advise them. So I know there's a lot of smart people, and they are putting a dent in the problem. The flip side is that the volumes of data being collected are so high. The clarity in the privacy legal space is so low. GDPR is not very prescriptive. I'm not complaining at all. They did the best they could 3 years ago. But how do you provide prescriptive guidance so companies know exactly what decision to make? That's where the gap is. The contextual gap between the policy apparatus on the one side and the engineering apparatus on the other is where my concern lies. And I feel this is the opportunity where I hope the privacy tech players can get in the mix and make solid recommendations so that the policy folks can then put them on paper and actually codify them. And that means it becomes a much more measurable, achievable outcome.
You highlight one of the problems we've had in privacy, right? Like, privacy is such a cross-functional space, and we really need the policy legal folks and the engineering and product folks to we really need to bridge that gap between them. And I'm hopeful that the privacy tech startups that we see coming up are mindful of that gap and are, have the resources and the expertise on both sides to be able to build a product that addresses policy problems and also does that within the code. So Nishant, I know we're at time, but I feel like we could keep talking for another hour on this, but I'll honor the time that we initially agreed on. So thank you so much for coming on. There's just so much there that I feel like is of value to our community. I hope the privacy tech startups out there are listening and learning from the insights that you've shared with them today. I would love to give you the opportunity to share, any calls to action that you might have, or if you prefer, if you'd like to get where folks can find you online through social media, if you prefer.
Definitely. So I'm pretty easy to find on LinkedIn because I'm the only person with my first name and last name. There goes my anonymity right there. But I'm also writing a book on privacy engineering. And this book is aimed at engineers, attorneys, architects who want to train themselves up in privacy and get started without having to hire people and have this major hiring campaign. So you have technical folks within your company. How do you train them? So it's being published by Manning Publications, due out in November. I've shared a link in the chat window. It's a mix of engineering, policy, product perspective on how do you get a privacy program up and going. I also have a LinkedIn learning courses page where I teach people how to build out privacy tech within their company, classification, categorization. Again, there are courses aimed at executives, engineers across the board. So I've shared that link as well. So those two should set you up for success, at least in getting your program off the ground.
So I'm trying to highlight those links. It looks like they're in the private chat, so I'm unable to put them on the screen, but we will make sure to put them in the posting when we publish this webcast. I'm quickly trying to see if I could put them in the public comments so we could put them on the screen, but no worries. We'll make sure to link to them when we publish the video. And thank you so much, Nishant. Everyone, thank you for tuning in today. This is our Defining the Privacy Tech Landscape series. We just recently, by the time this airs, we would have published our white paper on defining the privacy tech landscape, which Nishant also was very generous to join the working group the past couple of months. So thank you, Nishant. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Bye.